Welcome back. So we're I think a manageable group. We can just jump in, or maybe we'll use the raise the hand for those of you that know how to use the little thing. Um, but yeah, let's like maybe any questions that came up for you, curiosities um about something either that I shared or something made you think about and you were wondering. So maybe we'll begin with that. Some questions maybe or yeah. George, Georgia. Hi, Georgia.
Hey, how are you, Richard?
Good, good. Nice
You're
to
looking
see you.
good. Good to see you. Well, it's not so much a question, but it's something that just a brief comment that you made, which is so important to add to this. I now write a poem every morning, and I'm being encouraged by who I call my poetry son, Rick Hillis, to put together a collection for publishing. I probably have 2 or 3 thousand poems. And I started doing that to encourage daily to encourage my son, who is a prose writer. But the reason I got into that, you're talking about the company of poets and how important that was for me. I'd been a prose writer, a journalist by training, and when I first went to the Chautauqua Institution to take a workshop, workshops by people like Kevin Young, for example, Ted Kuzer, uh, I had not been a poet at all, but I fell into this nest of poets up there. And I love the company of poets, and I'm so inspired by the company of poets. So thank you for saying something about that, because I think that's important to be in the company of other people who are doing what you're doing and loving it. That's just my only comment.
Yeah, no, thank you for reminding me of that because I think that's often what I also uh, you know, uh, especially my undergraduate students, they're in this class and we meet for 3 months and we're talking about poetry and a lot of them are wondering, what am I going to do after I graduate? And this even happens with MFA folks after they graduate. I mean, you spend 2 years with look with poets and people looking at your work. And it's so important to tell them because that also, writing can be such a solitary endeavor. And then when we're just at our desks, we don't, I mean, being in the company of poets makes you feel like, yes, I am a poet, right? Like I am with these people. There's other people in the world doing this. And it's another way of, I think, growing as a writer and keeping yourself motivated to write. That you're not, it's not just you at your desk, with the, with the cat, on your desk, but that there are real people in the world doing these things, and it's so important and it's so uplifting, right? And inspiring too, because I mean, yeah, we read poetry obviously, but also just being in the live presence of a poetry reading, for example, just having people sharing listening to them and their stories that you don't always get just from reading the book. So I think that's a very important part of our vocation. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, Paul. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Richard. Well, I just want to say hi. And they're still, our conference was 2 weeks ago or so, and they're still talking about your standing ovation from your keynote speech. So thanks for that. But also, I'm going to dovetail off of what Georgia said too. It's being in the company of poets. Also, there's writers groups around all over the country. It's always worthwhile joining a writers group. I go to one at Ringling in Sarasota, Georgia. Um, Once a month, we meet on Wednesdays and spend 2 hours reading each other's poetry and tearing each other apart. And it's a good time. It keeps you in the loop and inspired, I think is what the answer is. And also reading Richard's poetry is also inspiring for us. So good stuff. Thank
And
you,
Paul,
Richard.
please, and we should mention that Georgia is a bookstore owner, so she knows exactly right in Sarasota, Bookstore One, right?
Yeah.
Who has been done incredible community work too. So it's also right. It's also being with poets, but also involving ourselves in poetry and literature and communities. And Georgia's bookstore has done amazing programs that I've participated to, reaching out to the schools. That's another way of keeping alive. But Paul, your organization, remind me of the name exactly again.
Florida Writers Association.
Right. I was so delighted by, that kind of support system. Just even just like, even some of the right. I think your newsletter stuff has like places to send poems or advertising, that keeps us also informed, right? Because that's also part of it. Like, how do what is the work of the writer out there? What do we do, right? So that's just an incredible organization for exactly those reasons that you're saying, and that Georgia brought up too. Yeah.
Thanks. And to also go back to Georgia too, she said at least three people from our group have read at the store. So,
Yeah.
it's, and which
Yes,
is,
Paul,
that's where,
I was going to ask you about
that's where,
that because I don't think you have read there because I don't think we've met that I remember. So
I've
yeah,
applied. I'm
story.
not for Georgia, but I've applied. It's just,
Okay.
I don't have a book of poetry. I'm kind of like you. I have 3,000 poems in the drawer and on my computer. And, I just got a rejection from one of the journals I just submitted to just as this was happening. So it's exciting.
Well,
But nonetheless,
that might be. I'm thinking again. This is like, this is a brand new endeavor for me, which is also part of what I'm going through right now, right? In terms of another career shift. Part of it is like I'm getting older. I can't be on the road as long, and I thought, why don't I do something that I can have. This is also health. This is also like, in a way, inspiring me and keeps me motivated as a writer to have these conversations and do that. But I'm thinking now. I think the next sort of forum I might offer was like, what is a book? What is a manuscript? I mean, Sean's done that with me, but what is that? How do we go about that? Like, that might be a good, since you both brought it up, like, what do I do with those 3,000 poems now? Right. Um, but Sean, you wanted to, yeah,
Yeah, well, I'd love to participate in that.
yeah.
What to do? You've got 3,000 poems. What I was gonna piggyback on was the community piece, and in terms of what gets you going. I've got a little funny too. So when you posted this, and I signed up and I'm all psyched, and you put the prompt next to it. You offered the prompt, right?
Right.
Me in my, okay, I've got a prompt. I've got to work on it. It's really gonna work this time. And it, it all fit in so perfectly together. All the ideas, what I wanted to do, the pieces that the prompt was asking for. So I just had that fun and excitement. But then I look back at what this is about, what we're here right now for, is about, and it's about acknowledging yourself as a poet. It's not about the prompt, Sean. So, okay. So just to,
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Yeah.
so anyway, but what I wanted to say about the community of and company of poets is that, what was it, 5 years ago, I was in a class with Richard, and we had to go virtual, which was brand new virtual. This is 2020. But what's come out of Eve, that class was great and motivational. But what's come out of that class is that we have continued getting together. And so that motivates, and so it's once a month and it's all virtual except once a year now we get together in person and see each other in 3D. It's pretty wild. Um, we and and it's like such a growing experience in ways that I didn't think of. It's common that you think of, okay, you're getting feedback from from these different people who, as if poetry can be quite intimate, right? And so explaining that, so you get to know these people really well, and the feedback can learning how to work with the feedback. Oh, that works for that person, or that person didn't make sense, or it didn't make sense to that person, but do I have to change it for that one person? So all the variations on feedback. But for me, another aspect of it is growing and responding to others' poems, knowing how to build my ability to respond to others and so therefore thinking about poems in different ways. Is it just the language? Is it the top hop, visuals that this person is giving me? Is it, or whatever other senses, which then improves my own writing because I have that kind of those questions going through my own head. And then lastly, it's for me anyway, it's wonderful to have a deadline.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so I have my deadline of our, whatever is it, what is it? It's the third Saturday of the month. I've got to have my shit together by the third Saturday of the month.
Yeah, you bring up some great points, and thank you for that. Again, another dimension of community, right? And not just sort of being the consumer of art, but also, like you were saying, like I often when I start my workshops, and you know this, Sean, I always say, it's a two-way street. It's not just that you are getting the feedback, but also when you have to articulate what it is that is working or not working in someone else's poem, right? Or what you feel the direction is. You're actually teaching yourself, right? Like you're creating critical vocabulary too for your own mind. And I often well, I did that all through graduate school, but I workshop myself, and I say to myself, well, Richard, I don't know if this is really working. Like I talk to myself in workshop mode because of what I learned with workshop. But I think another important thing that I often say too is that the sort of the kind of workshop has its limitations in terms of uh, one-offs. You can, I mean, they're very helpful, of course, but also having a group, because then there's other dialogue that happens, which you really get to know people's lives, like you're saying, and that sometimes with students, I'm like, you know what? 10-minute workshop is just not enough. Let's have a meeting where you tell me what you want this poem to do. And often in the workshop model, which is useful, right? You're not supposed to talk, and you're supposed to just listen when your poem is being workshopped. But there's another part of that I think is helpful. When you do have a friendship, and a long lasting friendship with another writer or several other writers, like you all do, the nine of you. Well, I know we're less than nine, but where you can open up that conversation that's not usually allowed in a workshop, or there's just no time for it. So that's another kind of workshop community is also important, and getting to know each other's works, their lives, and where it's coming from. And so helping each other sort of map out what your concerns are in your poetry, what is the through line of your work, and in more ways than it's not just a one-off poem, and you never see these people again. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So if you have a writers group, the other thing you said, Paul, was like, also I remember when I first started getting interested in poetry, me and a friend put on a reading series that was super fun to do too. So you can also be that person, right? And it was a great way of meeting writers, and also again being in the community of writers, and yet another way, right? Another dimension of sort of almost being that sponsor, that person that offers this to the world. So thank you for that. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah, Karen? Oh, yeah. You have to unmute yourself. This is the catchphrase of the 21st century. Should be in
I
the
uh,
Oxford Dictionary by now.
I I so enjoyed what you had to say about self-confidence and, and feeling like a fake. I remember I was an exhibiting artist for many years, and I always felt like a fake, even after the exhibition sold out. It was never good enough.
Right.
And I'm finding the process with poetry is the same
Yeah.
as the process with painting. There's such a relationship to me, a beautiful relationship. And I also am in that position where I write every day. And I've never counted my poems, but I at least have 3,000 poems. And I've been encouraged to publish, but it's that not good enough yet. I always feel the whole joy of this journey is tomorrow it's going to be better.
Uh,
And the excitement of waking up. I wake up at dawn, have my coffee, and and find the silence of the morning. It is just I'm passionate about it. but I never ever feel ready. And I would love to be in a position in a class with learning how to put the manuscript together already.
Right. I think we have that. I think that's going to happen next. I have taught it.
Great.
Uh, I was lucky enough that my mentor, now colleague, did a class. It was called the First Book class,
Oh,
and what we did was we looked at first book by poets, which are a unique animal, because our first book has certain strategies and things because of for all different reasons I won't get into, but it's particular, right? A first book is really it's something unique. And then we workshopped our manuscripts and learned we're looking at the book of poetry in terms of structure, what it's doing, how this works, what is the movement, what is a book of poetry, how do I decide what goes in, what goes out, how do you know so
right.
so I'll definitely do that. But you brought out something also, just so you know. um a writer friend of mine, I'm sorry, a painter friend of mine said something to the degree of uh you know to be an artist is to be a part of something that doesn't exist yet. And that's always in a weird way scary and terrifying and wonderful, right?
Yeah.
And I always remember that. I I wouldn't say I feel like a fake, but you do doubt, every time you sit down to your desk. And that's again the company of writers to let us know we're all feeling that, right? Um, I think that's actually it can be a healthy thing in some ways, right?
Yes.
Because you're challenging yourself to make that better poem, like you're saying.
Yes.
uh i uh I often tell my students as well, like, uh, you hope and pray that you are writing the worst poems of your life right now, right? Which is what you were saying, right? That it's going to get better and better and better, and don't
Yeah.
hold on to them too closely, especially when I'm talking about like late teen kids, like they think the last poem they wrote was the most. I'm like, no, keep on going, keep on going. Don't hang on to things too tightly. You're going to be learning by leaps and bounds at that age, especially. But I'll give you kind of what's a really motivational story, or anecdote, or example rather. My speaker's agent, which is Blue Flower Arts, which some of you may have come across them. She sold the company and she retired, and she started writing poetry out of the blue. Like, I mean, she always loved poetry, but she had never written any. Like,
Yeah.
and of course, all these years of surrounding herself by around poets, and I mean, and helping poets with their careers and uplifting them, something was sinking in. And in a matter of like 3 or 4 years, she skyrocketed, and her book was just accepted by Tupelo Press, her manuscript. And it was like, what? Like, she said on her birthday, she got the news and she was 70. She was turning 70. So there's a lot of stories like that too. A friend of mine also said sometimes, writing is an act of penance or something like that, where you just stick in there and you never know, but it's also the quiet joys. I think what you're
Mhm.
saying too about waking up in the morning, maybe that's something for us to think about too here. Process, right? In some ways, that's also motivational. That also makes us think about our world and having a little bit of a ritual. I'm a night to owl writer, so um, um, and mostly because I had a day job all my life. But I have, how do we get into that space when the rest of the world, especially if we have other busy lives with other careers or things going on. And for me, uh, one, I light a candle. I light a 3-wick candle. It has to be 3 wicks. And I light one wick to my literary ancestors, and uh, my peeps, so to speak. I light one wick for my family, my ancestry, and then one to my inner child, who I feel is the perfect. Never remember reading Blake said that the child is the perfect creator. Um, because even though we are talking about, it's always in the back of our minds. We want to get published, we want to do something with these poems and whatnot, but that we all know, I think, that the magic is that really really keeps us going is those moments where it's just you and the poem, and like the world just disappears and you're there for 2 hours and it felt like 5 minutes. And yet to me it's almost a divine connecting with the divine, with the divinity in the world. um and so yes, I mean, I think when we're talking about vocations, that's part of our, who doesn't, we want to be acknowledged for our work. There's nothing wrong with that either, I guess is what I'm saying. And the sunlight today in Maine is like it's all or nothing in Maine. It's either beautiful sunlight or snow, 18 feet of snow. But anyway, so yeah, that's part of negotiating our lives as writers, right? Our rituals, what we do to keep active, and even sometimes when I have a big project, I'll 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 change my writing location. Like I'll go to like the dining table. I when the inaugural poem assignment came in, I was like, I can't write this at my desk. I moved down to the basement. I was sprawled on the carpet. Like I needed to change just my environment because I didn't want to be reminded about email or anything like that. So yeah, just setting that tone for us is another way. And again, I think what we're saying too, like going to poetry readings, hosting poetry readings, having a group of writers, all those things help us to, stay in that space, right? But that's another yet more private dimension, but something that's important to acknowledge your I'm gonna be the writer now, right? Other thoughts or questions? Yeah, Dorothy. Hi, Dorothy. And then
Hi,
and then
Richard. Hi, everyone. I have so many questions I could ask. I I'm someone who wanted to be a writer like from childhood and then experienced so many creative blocks and like sort of took every like rejection or a negative or steering in a different direction as like a sign that I shouldn't be a writer, which now that I'm 43, I realize was a way to protect myself. And from like having this great dream and then not realizing it or having to do the hard work of um, you know going through achieving that dream. um, so I started writing again in earnest about 8 years ago when I had this process of like kind of awakening from that creative block and getting some encouragement to really deal with it. And my first book of poetry is coming out next year. I don't have an MFA, and I've thought a lot. I have a master's degree, actually. My degree is in interior design, and I do something completely different as a paid day job now. But I kind of have still a little bit of a block around the MFA. Like I find myself wondering, like, is it harder for me to publish because I don't have that MFA? And is there something um, that it would really help me to do in terms of achieving what I'm looking to achieve?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and then I also wanted to ask a little bit about, like you talked about getting your first book published, and even your second and third and fourth books. I'm curious, like how that exact process worked for you because I just submit. I take workshops and I submit, and my writing improves over time, and then eventually I get accepted. That's kind of how my first book
right.
worked. But I'm curious, like are there other ways to do it? And when I think about putting another manuscript together, I have my next book like ready to be kind of workshopped, and I'm not exact 100% sure
Right,
um,
right.
what to do next. And then lastly, just I'd love a workshop on like, so you have $0 to run a book tour. Like, what do you do from there?
That's a good one. So yeah, I'll take one. That's a great question that I think many of you might have on your minds. But the MFA, right? The big MFA question: do I get a master's in fine arts and creative writing? Um, I've done uh, I've done like 6 month courses that with other organizations. Precisely because there are people in their life that they're at a moment in their life, right? They're not going to get up and go. They don't need a degree. They don't, they're not going to pack up their lives and move somewhere to like, and especially, I mean, I couldn't imagine doing this at this age and being in a classroom with like, 20-year-olds, like I would feel really self-conscious, right? But, but couple of things to that. Uh, so just to acknowledge there's people a lot in that space, right? number one, I always say the real benefit of an MFA, what you're paying for at the end of the day, is that close attention to your work, right? They walk you through the process of creating a manuscript, which is very important. So you leave with a manuscript. You have 2 years or 2.5 years, sometimes 3 years of other people paying attention to your work, and that's always very valuable. And I would say, it's not anything that you can't learn on your own. It just accelerates the process, right? Because it's an intense study of over 2 years. So that's the real benefit. It sort of leaps you forward. But if you're already at a stage in your life where you have been writing, where you've been doing the workshops, I can tell you that nobody is publishing you or not publishing you because you got an MFA. I can tell you that, or even a book contest. I judge book contests all the time. I don't give a hoot if they've never taken a workshop in their life. It shows up in the writing, right? And at the end of the day, it's the quality of the work. That's all that matters. The MFA can support that. Um, the other option of doing that, there are some classes that are like longer range things. I haven't done one in a while, but look on the internet. Well, they'll be. I call it almost like a little mini MFA, right? Like, and this is where Sean comes from, right? And these people kept on working together, and so you also have that, which is part of the benefit of being in an MFA program. Three of my current readers are my friends from graduate school. So you have that, but never, yeah, you don't need an MFA to, nobody even looks at that. I mean, it's great if you do. Now, of course, there's networking that happens. And if you go to the Iowa workshop, well, you're going to be friends with like, poet laureates of the United States. But, what's the benefit of that? Can you even really put a finger on it? I think you're fine. It's really just more of a personal decision. The other option is you can do what's called a low residency MFA, which is I teach at Carlo at one of those things, and it's sort of a happy marriage between the two. You have this intense week and a half. You meet once or twice a year, with workshops and readers, and it's just you take that pause button out of the rest of your life, and this is what I'm going to do, and then it's just a mentorship program, and you basically over email, the mentor will give you assignments, reading, all this stuff, like Sean was saying, having the prompt, having the deadline. And I wanted to say also, before I forget, with poetry in particular, time can be too much time on your hands can be your enemy, right? Like, well, I remember when I first started teaching, I had all summer. I wrote my first book basically at lunch hour because that's the only time I had to like submit a poem. Um, and I thought the first summer I was going to kill it. I was going to write out like 2 books. By the middle of the summer, I was still revising one poem. But anyway, a sidebar. So as far as publishing first books, really contests are the primary way of doing that. And as you know, there's several. There's places, and I don't know if you know this now. I mean, but places like Duotrope. There's a couple of really great sites. Poets and Writers has a magazine where all these things are advertised. This contest is coming up, the deadlines, the guidelines. What the submittals are. That's one way, and the usual way for a first book. And actually, it's easier to publish a first book than a second book because there are so many first book contests. But there are now, because there's a plethora of smaller presses from back in my day. There was hardly, there were 5 prizes, there's 5 contests. That was about it. But now there's so many wonderful and legit small presses where actually not only do they have contests, but some have open reading periods. So you can actually send unsolicited manuscripts to them. And the person I just mentioned, that was I think it was a contest, but yeah, it was Tupelo, and these are really legit places for poetry now, right? And I think part of it is there's so many people with MFAs that want to participate in the world of being a writer, but there's not any teaching jobs. So there's been a lot more sort of small presses pop up, organizations that do things around poetry. So that would be another way. Just thinking about open reading periods. The other option, and you already have the first book, maybe for everyone else, besides publishing individual poems, I think that is important. For one reason, I do look at where the poem, when I see a book, and most of the contests are anonymous, but I do look that to see where they've published, not because they published this but it just shows that you are seriously, you are serious about yourself as a writer in the world, right? And like, yes, I have my work out there. Yes, it's been published. And it often lets me understand if there's, sometimes as judge, you doubt your own judging, right? I really love this book, but is it really good? And then when you see that this person has published, well, I guess other people think this poetry book is, I mean, these poems are good, but it's another way of vetting your poems. So you can, when we talk about creating a manuscript, which poems do you keep? Well, if you got this poem published in a pretty good journal, well, you can say, okay, that's probably a really pretty good poem. I can leave that one alone. I don't have to revise it to death. Like I definitely want to put that one in the manuscript somehow. But besides that, then the next step usually is writing a chapbook, right? That's a sort of an in between, and that's a little more tangible as a goal that might be a little more attainable. Though you can of course have a chapbook out and also a full length manuscript, right? But a lot of folks now do chapbooks, which again that has grown over the years. There's chapbook contests now too. So that's you may not have your next book. You may be like, well, I don't have quite another book, but let me see about putting a chapbook together and putting it out there in the world and see what happens. The good news is when you have that chapbook, you can use those poems, all of them, in a manuscript. It doesn't, it's not like it won't exclude you from later publishing a full length manuscript. I think there was a third question, or wait, that was like, what was the last thing?
Around the book tour, like
Oh,
you know, putting that book
um,
out there.
yeah, that one I might need to do some research, but um, uh, I will tell you that I think the most important thing is, first of all, think locally, right? Anywhere you can drive to. Like, the other thing is publishing itself from the manuscript is a way of advertising your book. It's poetry is weird because it's really there's other ways of getting the book out there, right? That aren't always like actually showing up, and that's expensive and whatnot. And I don't know how, and maybe Georgia would be able. I don't know if Georgia's still with us. Would be able to speak to that a little bit more. But one trick that I got taught when graduate school is once your book is accepted for publication, and it usually takes at least a year before it's out, you send every poem in that book out with a cover letter saying, my book was just accepted, it's going to be out. And you will be surprised at the turnaround time and the acceptance rate. It goes up because, again, having that credential already makes the readers feel this must be a really good poem because it's from a good manuscript and it just got awarded this thing. So and then having poems come out before the manuscript also is a way of advertising, right? This is forthcoming from whatnot. But Georgia, do you have any sense of like
Sure, but,
uh,
I do to a certain extent. I don't have any advice on getting publishing. If I did, I'd be published, right? But
no,
but
about the bookstore
but the
stuff, right?
bookstore, from the bookstore's point of view, though, I mean, we have solicitations all the time from authors who've written books about poetry and not poetry, but particularly when an author is fairly local to us and has had some, let's say, a poetry book published by doesn't have to be a big name press, but by a legitimate press, let's say. Uh, we're very open to having readings. And in fact, in our case, we have a regular series of what we call poetry mics, where we invite 2 to 3 poets at a time to present their work. And if they have books that they've published, then they can sell them at the store, etc. So we're open to that. I mean, to me, the more poets, the merrier. Actually, we do a lot with poetry. So there's that. So there's that. But while we're on this general subject, Richard, I want to ask you a quick question. What do you think of submittable? When Dorothy's asking about getting published, what's your opinion of that site? I'm just curious.
Oh, uh, well, I haven't used that one. I use Duotrope, and public writers and publisher. But I think that's most people go. Even some contests you submit, when I get the judging, it goes through submittable. So I haven't used it myself, but I just because I want to also mention before we get off to topic about I've seen a lot too where poets, I've even done that. Poets sometimes when they have a new book, they'll do a book launch on Zoom. And if you have poet friends, and I've been asked to sort of, you know, participate in the book launch, and it's a way of getting some critical mass so that, you know, they may not know the poet that's launching a book, but then I can bring my audience. And sometimes it's an onstage, sort of virtual onstage conversation. And it's a way of crowdsourcing in a way. And I think that's probably definitely more economical, but even bigger reach. So I think, you know, try to do things locally, but then think also, I think, you know, poetry is the good thing about poetry too, it has a very long life. It has a very long shelf life, right? I mean, my first book is still in print and still selling copies because, oh, I never knew about that book, right? So also don't feel like the need to sort of have to, you know, it's not the same as publishing a novel or something like, you know, once the novel's out 6 months, nobody cares, you know, like it's just like it's done on to the next season of publishing. Poetry has a long, I still read poems from my first book and still have it for sale on my readings. But Paul, I think you wanted to say something about this
No, I was just
submittable.
gonna, I use Submittable, and I also use Duotrope. I find Duotrope you could filter more easily,
Yeah,
and Submittable is much broader than that. So I kind of go back and forth between the two, and it's as Richard said too. A lot of times you'll go to the submissions page for a journal, and they'll bring you the Submittable, and then you got to go through Submittable, et cetera, et cetera. Submittable is easy because once you set it up, it goes automatically phone number, address, and all that other business. So both of them are, I think, valuable. Duotrope is allows you to filter more
yeah,
to your genre or your style,
right.
whatever.
And again, poets and writers, their magazine, I think, is also a great resource. As long as we're on that subject about placing poems, sometimes um, you know, what's helpful about these websites now is like they'll some cases, right, they'll say we're looking for this kind of poem because part of it is you want to try to match make your poem to a journal. You know, if it's the journal likes publishing experimental work and you're a narrative poet, why bother? You know, like, but also calls for anthologies and things like that. Where let's you know, we're doing an anthology about, I don't know, about Maine. Okay, I got a poem. I got a poem for you. Like you're zeroing in, you know, you're increasing the odds of right of getting published and placing your work. And sometimes also they have mini contests like where you send 3 or 4 poems and you get an award, and that's also a great feather in the cap. And it's more than just publishing a one-off poem. There's like I think Nemrod, I think it comes to mind. There's and you get a little, you know, title or whatnot. But Donicelli, I think you had your question your earlier or Donicelli. No, Donicelli.
Actually,
Donicelli,
it's
Donicelli.
Don Cellini. It's 2 words.
Oh, okay.
But I like Donicelli top also, you know. I think my questions and comments sort of you anticipated them with your last discussion here. But the 3 of the people who spoke earlier, I think it was Karen, Paul, and Georgia, all kind of sparked this question. They have thousands of poems that are sitting there. So my question comes down to this: is the person who is not published still a poet? Because I have a
Yeah.
friend who is a
Sure.
poet who would insist that if you haven't published, you're not a poet. And then I said, well, what about Emily Dickinson? Was she not a poet?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I agree with her, but this publishing thing is a huge part of being a poet. And it seems to be sort of a judgmental thing on the quality of the poet's work. And if you're not there, you're not there. I'm just throwing it out for comments and maybe for your observations as well.
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly legit question, and I think that comes down to more like how do you see yourself in the world, right? And Emily Dickinson being a good example, but as opposed to Whitman, who was like this bon vivant, like wrote his own blurbs and everything and faked, like it was like talk about PR, he was like the one, right? But they're both right, wonderful poets, right? I think it depends on what you're in it for. Uh, I think most of us really, I'll say this, and it has to do with the manuscript, and I'll say this, it's not necessarily just publishing, but I think putting together a manuscript and getting it published, or at least just putting it together, there's a sense of closure that I think is part of the artist's like sort of journey. Like, okay, this is this book, this is that part of my life, and it lets us move on as writers too, right? It says like this is, it's almost like, okay, I finished a gallery show, right? And I show those paintings, or here they are, even if I don't show them, but there they are, right? And there's something about that and creative process that I think is satisfying and also part of the journey as a writer. We all, I think most of us would, I mean, there's a thrill. I still, when I get a book in the mail, my book, I'm like, I still cry. I'm like, oh my God, who did this? Like, there's this, and there's just this sense of another kind of satisfaction. To your point, that's not going to sustain your career ever, or your motivation, or your writing. And like Maya Angelou said, every time I sit down to write a poem, it's the first time it's the first time I sit down to write a poem. So the laurels are great, and I think we can think about that in almost any career, right? Like, okay, there's these laurels, but then, you got to go back, and really the more important work and the work that sustains your soul is that challenging, is that you in that quiet space in that, and at your desk or whatever, sprawled on the rug. But to your point too, and this is, I was going to say this earlier, what I do, and I think is healthy in that sense, so you don't get caught up in dawn in like this world of, am I going to get published, and all this, the ego starts coming in, and then you're a piece of shit, and like, no, you're a wonderful writer, you know. Um, I try to separate the two. So I have seasons. So I try to like, okay, I'm just going to do nothing but write and not worry about any about publishing or anything like that. And then once I have a certain number of poems or something like that, or when I have a manuscript drafted or something like that, I'll start sending out poems and then focus on the business of poetry, so to speak, right? On the publishing business and like that, because it's very hard to, when you get a rejection slip and you're working on a poem that you're really excited about, you're like, oh shit. So to your point, Don, I think it's important to separate those two things, even if you don't disregard publishing whatsoever, but to separate it and put it in dedicate time for it. It's a different bin. It's a different part of our job, so to speak. A different kind of satisfaction we get from it. But I try not to mix those two things. When I'm in creative mode, it's, yeah, let's be Emily Dickinson and screw the rest of the world and all this, all the fears of publishing or not publishing. I think that's very healthy, and definitely that's something I try to practice. But you're still a poet, yeah. The only danger in that is that I think, and sometimes my students, um, you know, uh, it's not that you have to publish really, but the idea that I try to instill in them, like, we're not, this is not just pure self-expression, right? That's that's something else, right? The idea that you're writing, period, knowing that this is something that's going to be shared in some way, shape, or form, that takes on a different tone, right? That means I am making art, right? I am going to follow the precepts of art. And the art is going to take me to places of discovery that I wouldn't otherwise if I just stay locked in my own bin. And let's not even talk about publishing, but everything we're always talking about, like even just being in a writers group, that kind of feedback is also, in a way, it's not just to make your poems better, but it's also about being a writer, right? So I would say that. And then before I forget, I wanted to also recommend a book to I forgot if some people might have had to leave, uh, to the question of writing process and creativity and what does all that mean. There's a great book which many of you probably have read, or is called Writing Down the Bones, by Natalie Goldberg. And so it's really based on, why am I a writer? What the hell is this about? It's more creative process driven and more psychological. She's a Zen Buddhist. So it's not about the craft of writing per se, but the living the life of a writer. What does that mean? And that might help to navigate some of those questions you might have, is that, yeah, why am I doing this stuff, and why does it matter? And how does it matter, right? How does it matter to me? And I always try to read some of those books every once in a while too, because I still read Writing Down the Bones. I teach it and I read it again and again, because it always teaches me again, like, oh yeah, that's what I'm in this really for, right? Like, so it's always good to pick up those kinds of books too. I think someone, oh yes, Garrett, how are you?
Yeah, I'm sorry, my name there is funny. That's my last name, but
Right,
I'm
right.
Ira Batra Garde, and I have to change that. And Ira spelled IRA, but pronounced ERA. And Richard, it's very nice to see you. I've been
Likewise.
in a couple of your workshops, and frames, which I wrote in your workshop, just got published.
Yes.
And in this anthology by Tulip Tree Anthology. And they're very nice in supporting new poets, I found out, or by they give, like, you're a semi-finalist, and then you get an honorable mention if you're in the book. So that, I mean, there are publishers out there who want to support new poets. And I just want to say I'm glad you've emerged again in this role.
Yes.
It sounds like because you sort of disappeared in your busy world, and somehow this makes me feel like you're emerging as a mentor to some and in some way in this new phase, or and I'm a physician, and one of my favorite poets is William Carlos Williams, the
Of course.
Plums, right?
Right.
And I have in the last few years, I did get some real encouragement for a manuscript I've put together. And they said, it's part of the course to be rejected. So my son made a spreadsheet, and whenever I just write declined in one column and the date. So I don't worry about if it's the 105th literally or whatever, wherever I am. I put in my submission in the column and then declined. Some here I've been able to say accepted or something for a poem, but I don't really pay much more attention, and I just keep working on the manuscript. And I'm at like, I want to get the manuscript done, and it's hard for me to be creative with new poems. And I remember writing new poems. I remember how many looking at these poems, what it's taken to get them to be where they are. So I'm kind of reluctant just to send out the newest thing. And I'm
Right.
just trying to shape the manuscript. And I have done a workshop that has helped me, because nobody really looks at the manuscript. And there was a workshop at Tupelo that there was a group of people, and then they didn't actually shape your manuscript, but they gave you ideas.
Right. Right.
And I think it really changed shape. And um, without somebody doing it for me, which was kind of rewarding. It was just hearing all this stuff, and then I could incorporate it in how to shape the manuscript. So I think that's even better now, and I'll keep sending, but I'm in the process of revising it, looking at each poem again. And then, I wonder if, for example, you'd be willing to do that. You were talking about doing manuscript reviews, but even an individual, obviously for a good fee, if to look at somebody's manuscript.
Yeah, yeah, that's part of, again, again, like, you're right. It's a new phase for me, and in all this world. Like I was saying, the journey continues, but I can't be on the road, that much anymore. Like, my back hurt, my knees going, But yeah, that's one of the offerings. There's on the website, under workshops tab, one is sort of a mini review, which is like, just a few pages, just to give you a sense of your work and where it's going, what are some of the themes or concerns or obsessions, maybe a direction for a manuscript someday, or for a chapbook, more of a verbal kind of, like, sort of consultation. And then there's a larger book project kind of thing, which is, of course, that would just have to be negotiated. But what I'm thinking, what I'm getting from this group, I'm going to do a workshop before that of just, here's the P's and Q's of what I was taught and what I have taught, because I taught that class that I was taught at my alma mater. And sort of course, not, we're not a manuscript workshop class, but at least giving you some of the pointers, what goes into a book of poetry, why it's great to have a manuscript, what are some of the strategies that are just practical. Like, for an example, you always want to open the book with at least 2 or 3, like, killer poems, right? Because you got to get through readers that, if you don't get them invested in the book, you know, the book is not going to be put forward. So little small things like that, that are, sort of feel like they're utilitarian, but really they're practical things that go into making manuscripts. We could do a workshop, not a workshop, but really just here's A to B. This is sort of what goes into a book and why does it matter? And also to think about, it's often true with it. There are no, even in an MFA, to be honest, like your thesis advisor doesn't necessarily, it depends on the advisor. It doesn't always necessarily go through a lot of pains um of thinking about the manuscript, right? But if I'll just leave you with this little note that really, if you think about a manuscript or even a chapbook, it's really like one poem. It's kind of, it has an arc, right? If you think about what a book of poetry is doing, right, where it begins with something, the tension increases, there's some kind of turn, there's something happens, right? And we call it different things. It's not a plot, right? But there's equivalent of it. It's sort of like there's an emotional arc in the book, right? Or there's some kind of transformation that happens to the speaker, the poet speaker in the poem, right? Of course, that's as unique as every individual life, what that is. But if you kind of think about what a book of poetry does, it's kind of the same journey that a poem takes you on, except over several, right? Poems are doing that work. I forget if our visual, oh yeah, there you are, Karen. I often compare it to also like doing an exhibition, right? Where, okay, I've painted all these paintings, but how am I going to hang them, right? Like, and what story do they tell now, right? And how am I going to walk through this space in a way that makes that right? Well, there's in a way that then the show becomes more powerful than just hanging up 20 paintings wherever because it looks good there, so, and I can tell you as a judge, like we look for those things because if there's two sort of authors whose work is pretty much, comparable in terms of the quality, but one has gone through the effort of really creating an arc, a story for the reader to follow and sections, you usually end up awarding that book because you feel like that work was done, right? Like this feels like a book of poetry. So that's also part of it, a part of what some of the strategies and things that we think about. Yeah.
So did I miss, like, did I not read, like, which, like, how does one get in touch with, and what did I miss to have even asked my question? Is there a part of your website that I should go
Yeah,
to?
yeah. Under what under under workshops, at the very bottom, there's those offerings and where and how to write and get in touch with that. Yeah. And every once in a while, and you're right, I'm out of retirement, but a little bit, there's a lot more offerings in the summer. I'm sure you all know that, a lot of virtual stuff because all the professors are off school, they're not teaching. So there's a plethora of things you could do online, and in terms of if you don't already have a writers group like you, Sean, where you can go in person. Some of them are virtual. And so yeah, take advantage of that if that's something you'd like to do. The other thing, I'll leave you with too, in terms of being a poet. There's writers retreats, right? And some of these are very prestigious, like the McDowell and what's the other one? The one in Saratoga. Um, but you have to apply, and it's really competitive, and I've always hated that. I don't need permission. I don't need your permission to write. I mean, I get it. It's wonderful you're in the community of writers, but sometimes I create my own little writing retreat. Uh, I remember when I was living in Miami full time, I would rent like some cheap motel in Key Largo in the dead of summer when it's like, $59 for the week, and just take my printer and my computer and just go somewhere. The Keys are great because it's relaxing, but there's not a whole lot to do. So you can't go out touristy and like, unless you have a boat, there's really not much to do in Key Largo. But I create my own little writing retreat. So think about that too. If you need to get away, you can always treat yourself to that, right? And you don't always need permission from someone to do that. All right. I think we're about time, is it? Yeah. Unless we have time for maybe one last comment or question. Yeah. Karen? Yeah. Or anybody that hasn't gone? Yeah. Okay, we're good, Karen. Yeah.
I forgot to tell you how much I enjoyed you at the Poets Corner, and
Oh,
I
great.
look forward to many workshops with you, Richard. I'm a great admirer of,
Oh, thank you.
of your
Thank you.
work. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Karen. And thank you for bringing up that. Everybody write that down, the Poets Corner. It is an amazing the founder of that was the director, the former executive director of Maine Media Workshops in college, which where I've met several of you here on the screen. But she went off talk about another thing she did, right? Like she loves poetry. She quit her job and started this whole Poets Corner thing. It's caught on like wildfire. I mean, Billy Collins has been there. Naomi Shihab Nye. We're trying to get Ada. I'm on their advisory board. We're trying to get Ada, I was going to say Ada Lovelace, Ada Limon on there. But talk about a way of keeping, and it's free. Um, they have great readings, but also thematic sort of sessions, like they do the poetry of Rilke, for example. And so, yes, everyone write that down.
And they have
it's a
you.
great, yeah, every once in a while. But yeah, I'm on their advice. I believe in it so much. But that's another example of someone who has also published the book, but then later in life just decided this is what I love doing, and has created this phenomenon. Besides writing herself, it was a way of her keeping engaged too, right? I'm not going to wait to be asked to go to a poetry reading, or be invited to read my work. I'm going to create my own world here for all of us, right? So that's sort of almost like a virtual bookstore reading place. Well, this has been very exciting, everyone. I'm so glad. I knew I would get. I'm grateful for many. First of all, we're going to do that manuscript thing. I didn't realize that was such a curiosity. I knew it was out there, but I've also learned a few things from all of you, which I will, in the spirit of community, pass forward to my conversations with other writers and poets and whatnot. So thank you, and yeah, let's stay in touch.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Many blessings. And as I always end my emails to my students, right on, like right
In a safe
on.
world.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great
Thank you,
weekend.
Richard.